A millionaire asks his driver to take him on one last trip, but what he discovers along the way changes everything. Robert Thompson, a simple driver, receives an unexpected request from his enigmatic employer, Edward Collins. A final journey, filled with memories and secrets buried in the past, begins to reveal a dark destination and a bond he never imagined. Between painful confessions and discoveries that could change everything, Robert finds himself facing a truth that could destroy his family. Robert Thompson, a 45-year-old man, drove through the streets of San Antonio, Texas, with the same skill he had acquired over the years as the private driver of Edward Collins. Edward, a 78-year-old man, was known for his wealth, accumulated over decades of successful investments and business ventures. To many, he was just a reserved businessman, but to Robert, he was something more. Edward had always been fair to him, paying a good salary and treating him with respect. However, in recent months, Robert had been facing difficulties that even his generous salary couldn't resolve. Robert's wife, Linda, had been diagnosed with a rare and debilitating illness. The treatment was expensive, and medical bills were rapidly piling up. Every day, Robert found himself more worried about the future, questioning how he would support his family and take care of his wife's health. He had 2 children, one aged 10 and the other 15, who needed attention and support, but his mind was constantly occupied with bills and Linda's health. One morning, while cleaning Edward's car in the mansion's garage, Robert was surprised by the soft, raspy voice of the elderly man. "Robert, I need a favor from you. I want you to take me on one last trip," Edward said, with a tone of voice that suggested an unusual urgency. Robert looked up, surprised. In all the years he had worked for Edward, he had never received such a peculiar request. It was common for him to drive him to meetings, events, and quick visits, but a last trip sounded enigmatic. "Of course, Mr. Collins. But, if I may ask, where are we going?" Robert asked, trying to hide the apprehension that was beginning to take hold of his chest. Edward only smiled, a smile that seemed to carry years of secrets and regrets. "You'll find out along the way, Robert. Just trust me. We'll leave tomorrow morning. Prepare for a long journey." Although he had no further details, Robert knew he couldn't refuse. Edward had always been a good employer, and he felt that this was his opportunity to repay him in some way. Maybe this trip was a chance to temporarily escape the worries that consumed him, or perhaps to discover something about the enigmatic old man he had worked for so long. That night, Robert told Linda about the unexpected request. She was lying in bed, visibly tired after another treatment session. "That's strange, Rob. What could he want?" Linda asked, the concern reflected in her eyes. "I don't know, but I'll find out. Maybe he just needs company to deal with something. Anyway, he's always been good to us, so I owe him that," Robert replied, trying to sound more confident than he actually felt. Linda sighed, her eyes seeking Robert's for some reassurance. "Be careful, Rob. I don't know why, but this gives me a strange feeling. Don't worry, I'll be fine. I'll find out what he wants, and I'll be back soon," Robert assured her, trying to ease his wife's concerns. The next day, Robert got up early, dressed in his usual white shirt and black dress pants, and drove to Edward's mansion. The sun had barely risen when he arrived, but Edward was already waiting at the entrance, dressed simply, which was unusual for him. There was something different in the old millionaire's gaze, something Robert couldn't decipher. "Ready, Robert? We have a long road ahead," Edward said as he got into the car. Robert, unsure of what to expect, simply nodded and started the engine. As they left the deserted road, he wondered what was really behind this mysterious trip. The trip started in silence, with only the sound of the engine and the light hum of the road breaking the quiet between Robert and Edward. The old man was more introspective than ever, looking out the window with a distant gaze, as if each mile they traveled was taking him back to the past. Robert respected the silence, but his mind was buzzing with curiosity. Where were they going? And why did this trip seem to carry such emotional weight for Edward? After a few hours on the road, Edward broke the silence. "Robert, stop at a gas station in the next town. I want to get a coffee and stretch my legs." Robert nodded and followed the instructions. When they arrived at the small gas station in a town called Fredericksburg, Edward got out of the car and took a deep breath, as if the fresh country air brought back distant memories. The two entered the diner next to the station, where Edward ordered a black coffee and Robert an iced tea. They sat at a table in the corner, away from the curious glances of the few customers present. Edward watched the activity in the diner, the customers coming and going, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. After a long sip of coffee, he finally began to speak. "You know, Robert, when I was young, I had big dreams. I wanted to conquer the world, be someone important, someone everyone admired. And I did. But at what cost?" Edward said, his voice heavy with melancholy. Robert looked at him, realizing that this trip was more than just an excursion. It was a journey of confessions. "Mr. Collins, what do you mean by that?" Edward sighed, staring at the coffee cup as if the answers were there. "At 30, I was married to the most wonderful woman you could imagine. Evelyn was her name. We had a daughter, Maggie, our little gem. But in pursuit of success, I abandoned everything. I left my family behind, chasing business deals, fortunes, and status. Evelyn, she never forgave me. And Maggie, well, she grew up without a father. I left them for something that now seems so insignificant." Robert remained silent, absorbing Edward's words. He had never imagined that the millionaire, always so reserved, had such a sad and regretful story. "I tried to come back years later, but when I did, they were already gone. Evelyn died of a broken heart, it seems, and Maggie, I never heard from her again," Edward continued, the pain evident in his voice. Robert felt a lump in his throat. He knew well the pain of seeing his family suffer, but he couldn't imagine the regret of having abandoned everything for a hollow life. "Mr. Collins, I'm sorry to hear that. I didn't know," Robert said, sincerely moved. Edward shook his head, as if trying to push the feelings away. "It's not your fault, Robert. I've never spoken about this with anyone. But now, I feel it's time to settle the past." They finished their drinks in silence and were soon back on the road. The atmosphere in the car was heavy with Edward's revelations, but Robert knew that this was only the beginning. Edward still hadn't revealed the final destination of the trip, but Robert was beginning to understand that the purpose went far beyond a simple excursion. The following hours were marked by more stops. First, a small town where Edward had grown up, and then an abandoned factory he had managed in his youth. At each stop, Edward shared more about his life, recounting stories that carried both success and loneliness. "I was the king of my own empire," Edward commented as he looked at the ruins of the old factory. "But in the end, I was just a lonely man, surrounded by riches that couldn't fill the void I created." Robert felt a growing admiration for the man beside him, but also a deep sadness. Edward seemed to be seeking redemption, a way to reconcile with the past before it was too late. However, there was something in Edward's words that troubled Robert. A feeling that this journey was becoming increasingly personal for him, something he still couldn't fully understand. The last stop before heading to the final destination was an old country house, where Edward recalled spending summers with his family. He described moments of happiness that now seemed distant and unattainable, as if they were memories of a life that never truly belonged to him. Robert listened attentively, feeling that something within him was also beginning to change. The sun was setting when Edward asked Robert to follow a dirt road that led to a small town called Willow Creek. The path was narrow and flanked by old trees, which seemed to whisper stories from the past. The atmosphere became even denser, and Robert felt a tightness in his chest, a strange sensation that something important was about to happen. After a few minutes of silence, Edward pointed to a modest, abandoned house by the side of the road. "Stop here, Robert. We've arrived." Robert parked the car in front of the house, which appeared to have been abandoned for a long time. The windows were broken, the paint peeling, and the garden overgrown with weeds. There was something melancholic about the sight, as if the house had been waiting for someone to return. "This was my house," Edward said, breaking the silence, his voice heavy with emotion. "I lived here with Evelyn and Maggie, before everything fell apart." Robert looked at the house, trying to imagine what that place meant to Edward. He had never seen him so vulnerable, so exposed. Edward got out of the car slowly, as if each step was an effort. Robert followed him, sensing that this moment was crucial. As they entered the house, the smell of mold and abandonment filled the air. The old furniture was still there, covered in dust and cobwebs. Edward walked to the fireplace in the living room and stopped in front of an old black and white photograph on the mantelpiece, where a young woman and a small child smiled beside a much younger Edward. "Evelyn and Maggie," Edward whispered, touching the edge of the photograph. "I left them here, and I never saw them again. This house, it's all that's left of my past." Robert remained silent, respecting Edward's painful moment. He could feel the old man's sadness, and a deep empathy overcame him. But at the same time, there was a restlessness within him, a sense that something was about to be revealed. "Robert," Edward said suddenly, turning to him, "I never had the chance to ask Maggie for forgiveness, to tell her how much I regret it. I don't know where she is or if she's still alive, but I need to try before it's too late." Robert felt a chill down his spine upon hearing these words. Something inside him urged him to ask more, to try to understand the true connection between him, Edward, and that house. He took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "Mr. Collins," he began hesitantly. "I don't know how to say this, but my wife, Linda, she always told me she was an orphan. She never knew her parents, and I always respected that. Never wanted to pressure her to talk about the past. But now, hearing your story, I feel like there's something more here. Something I'm not understanding." Edward looked at Robert with a mixture of surprise and interest. "Linda, your wife, how old is she, Robert?" "She's 42, Robert replied, the discomfort growing. Edward seemed to freeze for a moment, as if processing something he had never considered before. He looked intently at Robert, as if seeing him for the first time. Linda could be my Maggie?" Edward murmured, incredulous. "Maggie was only 3 years old when I left her, but the age, the story, it all fits." Robert felt the ground crumble beneath his feet. Edward's words echoed in his mind, but he didn't want to believe what he was hearing. How could his wife be Edward's daughter, the woman he had abandoned so many years ago? He remembered the few times Linda had spoken about her past, always vaguely, without going into details. Could it be that she was Maggie, Edward's lost daughter? "It can't be," Robert said, almost as if trying to convince himself. This doesn't make sense." But the expression on Edward's face said otherwise. He seemed to have been hit by a painful truth, one he had never expected to discover. "Robert, we need to know the truth. I can't die without at least trying to make peace with her." The moral dilemma Robert faced was overwhelming. If Linda really was Maggie, it would mean confronting a past she had probably tried to forget. He knew he should tell her, but at the same time, he feared the consequences of such a revelation. How would it affect her? How would it affect their family? "Mr. Collins," Robert said with a trembling voice, "if my wife really is your daughter, I don't know how she'll react. I don't know if she's ready for this, or if I am." Edward placed a hand on Robert's shoulder, a gesture of understanding. "I understand, Robert, and that's why I need your help. I don't have the courage to face her alone, but I also can't ignore this possibility. Can you help me do this the right way?" Robert took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. The tension in the car was palpable as Robert drove back home to Austin. Edward was silent, lost in his thoughts, while Robert struggled internally with what he had just discovered. What should he do? Tell Linda everything he had learned? Or spare his wife from a truth that could bring more pain than relief? Robert couldn't deny the overwhelming feeling that fate had conspired to bring Edward back into Linda's life. But how could he manage this without tearing apart his own life? When they arrived at Robert's house, the sky was dark, dotted with stars. Edward hesitated for a moment before getting out of the car, his face reflecting the weight of the moment. Robert accompanied him to the door of the house, his heart pounding. He knew he was about to risk everything he knew. Linda was in the living room, sitting on the couch with a book in hand, when the two men entered. She looked up and smiled, surprised to see Edward. She knew Robert's old employer, but she never expected to see him in her home. However, as soon as her eyes met Edward's, something changed. Linda's smile disappeared, and her expression became serious, almost shocked. "Linda," Robert began hesitant. "This is Edward Collins. I know you already know him, but there's something I need to tell you." Before Robert could continue, Edward stepped forward, the emotion evident in his eyes. "Maggie," the word, spoken with so much hope and regret, cut through the air like a knife. Linda turned pale, her eyes widened in surprise, and she brought her hand to her mouth, unable to process what was happening. She shook her head, as if trying to push away what she was hearing, but tears began to stream down her face. You're my father?" Linda managed to say, her voice breaking with emotion. Edward nodded, his eyes welling up with tears. "Yes, Maggie, it's me, your father. I know it's a lot to accept all at once, but I need you to understand that I deeply regret leaving you. I spent my whole life trying to cope with the guilt, but I never had the courage to look for you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I wanted a chance. One last chance to make things right." Linda looked at Robert, as if searching for an explanation. Robert approached, holding her hands. "Linda, I only found out today during the trip. I didn't know what to do. I never wanted to hurt you." She pulled away, letting go of Robert's hands, and turned to Edward, the tears now flowing freely. "I spent my whole life thinking you abandoned me without a second thought, that you never cared about me or Mom. We suffered so much, and I had to grow up without a father. And now, after all this time, you show up and want to make things right." Edward seemed even older at that moment, as if the weight of his actions was finally catching up with him. "I know I can't undo the past, Maggie. I know my words won't erase the pain you felt. But I want you to know that I always loved you. I was a foolish man, blinded by ambition, and I left behind the people who mattered most. I don't want to die with this on my heart. I just want you to know that I regret it more than you can imagine." The silence that followed was overwhelming. Linda looked at her father, her mind torn between the desire to forgive and the resentment built up over so many years. Robert stood by, anxious, not knowing what to do. The final decision was in Linda's hands, and he knew he had to support her, no matter what she chose. After a few minutes that felt like an eternity, Linda finally spoke. I always knew who you were, Dad. I always knew that Edward Collins was my father, but I never wanted to accept it. I couldn't bear the idea that you left us because of money, because of power. I tried to move on, to build a life, a family. But there was always this gap, this pain that I could never fill. Edward closed his eyes, letting the tears flow down his deep wrinkles. "I'm so sorry, Maggie. If I could turn back time, I would do everything differently. But now, all I can do is ask for your forgiveness and, if you'll allow me, try to help you and your family." Linda took a deep breath, struggling to control the emotions bubbling inside her. She looked at Robert, who nodded slightly, encouraging her to make the decision she felt was right. Then, she approached Edward, who looked at her with a mixture of hope and fear. "I don't know if I can forgive you completely, "Dad," she said, her voice still trembling. "But I also can't keep holding onto this resentment forever. I want to try to get to know you again and see where it leads us. But it's going to take time." Edward let out a sigh of relief, the tears now flowing freely. "Thank you, Maggie. Thank you for giving me this chance." Linda finally allowed herself to embrace Edward, wrapping him in a tight hug as if trying to make up for lost time. Robert watched the scene, feeling a wave of relief and emotion. He knew that this decision would change their lives forever, but he hoped it would be for the better. In the days that followed the reunion, Robert, Linda, and Edward's lives entered a kind of transition. Edward decided to stay in Austin for a while, renting a small house nearby so as not to invade Robert and Linda's privacy, but close enough to see them regularly. He wanted to make the most of every moment to make up for the lost time with his daughter. Linda, on the other hand, was dealing with an emotional roller coaster. Although she had decided to give her father a chance, the years of resentment didn't disappear overnight. She found herself torn between anger and the desire for reconciliation. Conversations with Edward were often difficult, full of awkward silences and painful memories. However, there were also moments of tenderness, when father and daughter shared stories and laughter, trying to rebuild a relationship that had been interrupted for decades. Robert watched all this with a mixture of hope and concern. He knew that Linda was fragile, both because of her illness and the emotions now coming to the surface. At the same time, he saw in Edward a genuinely repentant man, someone who was trying to do what was right, even if it was too late. One night, after the children were already asleep, Linda and Robert sat on the porch of the house. The air was cool, and the silence of the night was comforting. Linda seemed pensive, looking at the stars with a distant expression. "Do you think I'm doing the right thing, Robert?" she asked, finally breaking the silence. "I want to forgive him, but at the same time, I feel so much pain. I spent years building a life without him, and now he's back, wanting redemption. I don't know what to think." Robert held Linda's hand, squeezing it gently. "I think you're doing the best you can, Linda. It's not easy to forgive, especially after everything you've been through. But I see that you want to give him a chance, and that's already a big step. The most important thing is that you do what's right for you. There's no need to rush. It's okay if you need time." Linda sighed, closing her eyes tightly as if trying to hold back the tears. "I feel like I have to be strong, not just for myself, but for our children. They've never known my past. They've never known that I had a father who left me. How can I explain this to them now?" Robert moved closer, wrapping her in a comforting embrace. "We'll handle it together, Linda. We don't have to tell them everything at once. We'll go slow, one step at a time. You're not alone." The next day, Edward showed up at Robert's house with a serious, determined expression. He asked to speak with both of them, and Linda, still adjusting to the new dynamic, agreed. Sitting in the living room, Edward began to speak, his voice filled with sincerity. "I know this reconciliation has been difficult for you, Maggie. Linda," he corrected, realizing it might be too soon to use the affectionate nickname from the past. "But there's something I need to do. Something I should have done a long time ago." Linda watched him cautiously, while Robert remained by her side, supporting her silently. Edward took an envelope out of his pocket and placed it on the table in front of them. "This is a document transferring a significant part of my fortune to you," he explained. "I know money can't erase the mistakes of the past, but I want you and your family to be secure. I want you to have everything you need, especially now with your health, Linda." Linda looked at the envelope, unsure of how to react. I don't know if I can accept this, Dad," she said, hesitant. "I don't want you to think you can buy my forgiveness." Edward shook his head, his expression sad. "I understand, and that's not what I'm trying to do. But the truth is, I don't have much time, Linda. My health is not good. I don't have much more to offer besides what's left of my fortune. and I want it to go to you, to your family. I want to make sure you'll be okay, even when I'm no longer here." The weight of Edward's words hung in the air, and Linda felt a lump form in her throat. She knew he was telling the truth, that their time together was limited. The thought of losing her father again, now that she was beginning to forgive him, was almost unbearable. "Dad," she began, but the words failed her. Instead, she stood up and approached Edward, holding his hand tightly. "I'll accept, but not for the money. I'll accept because I want us to have a chance to truly know each other, before it's too late." Edward smiled, his eyes filled with tears. "That's all I could ask for, Maggie. Linda, that's all." That night, as Linda and Robert reflected on everything that had happened, they knew the future would still bring challenges. Linda was determined to make the most of the time she still had with her father, but she also knew she would need strength to face what was to come. Robert, for his part, was determined to support Linda every step of the way, ensuring that their family remained united and strong in the face of adversity. The following weeks brought a transformation in everyone's lives. Edward's presence, once a troubling shadow of the past, had now become a light of hope, a bond that united Robert and Linda in a new chapter of their lives. Linda, still dealing with her illness, began to open up more to her father. Their conversations became less about what had been lost and more about what could still be built. Edward, for his part, found a peace he had never known. He dedicated his days to caring for Linda and his grandchildren, something he never imagined he would have the opportunity to do. There was a serenity in his eyes, as if he had finally found late redemption. The children, who at first were wary of their grandfather's presence, began to grow fond of him, seeing him not just as a distant, wealthy figure, but as part of their family. One day, while Edward and Robert were walking through the park near the house, Edward stopped to watch the children playing in the distance. He turned to Robert with a serious yet calm expression. "Robert, I want you to know how grateful I am for everything you've done," Edward began. "You could have kept this discovery to yourself, you could have avoided all this pain for Linda, but you chose the truth. And because of that, I'm getting the chance to reconcile with my daughter." Robert nodded, feeling the weight of Edward's words. "I did what I thought was right. Linda deserves this chance, and I also knew you were seeking redemption. In the end, I think we all needed this." Edward paused for a moment, looking out at the horizon. "You know, Robert, I was never a man of grand emotional gestures. I always let money speak for me, but now I understand how empty that was. You've shown me something different, something that goes beyond what money can buy." Robert looked at Edward, recognizing the sincerity in his words. "Money can help with many things, but it can never replace what's most important. Family, love, forgiveness. Those are the things that truly matter." Edward smiled, a smile that seemed to ease years of regret. "That's why, Robert, I want you to know that my decision to transfer part of my fortune to you is not just an attempt to right the wrongs of the past. It's also because I see in you someone who can use this to do good, to take care of your family and help others. I want you to be my successor, not just as someone who manages my business, but as someone who carries forward a different legacy, a legacy of compassion." Robert was surprised, not expecting such a great responsibility. "Mr. Collins, Edward, this is much more than I could have imagined. I don't know if I'm ready for something like this." Edward placed a hand on Robert's shoulder, the weight of his decision reflected in his gaze. "I know you are. You've always been an honest man, someone who puts others before yourself. That's exactly the kind of person I want to continue what I started, but in a better, more humane way." As Robert absorbed Edward's words, he felt a new responsibility forming in his heart. He knew that his life was about to change in ways he had never imagined, but he also knew that this change came with a greater purpose. Days later, Edward, now more frail, gathered the entire family at his house. He knew his time was running out, but he wanted to ensure that his last words were of gratitude and love. Sitting in his favorite armchair, surrounded by Linda, Robert, and the grandchildren, he took a deep breath, feeling complete for the first time in years. "I want you all to know how much you mean to me," Edward said, his voice weak but full of emotion. "Linda, my dear daughter, I deeply regret all the suffering I caused you, but I'm also grateful that you gave me the chance to redeem myself, to be part of your life again." Linda held Edward's hand, tears streaming down her face, but this time they were tears of acceptance, of a forgiveness she had finally been able to give. "Robert," Edward continued, "you were more than a driver to me. You were a friend, a confidant, and now I see you as the man who will continue something I never had the wisdom to do. I trust you to take care of my family and everything I've built, in a way I never knew how." Robert, moved, nodded. "I'll do my best, Edward. I'll honor your trust." Edward smiled one last time, feeling at peace. Then everything is as it should be. In the weeks following Edward's passing, Robert took on the responsibility of managing Edward's fortune, but not as the millionaire Edward once was. He decided to use the resources to support social causes, help families in need, and, above all, ensure that his own family received the care and support they had always needed. Linda, now reconciled with her past, found a new strength within herself. Although her health was still fragile, the weight of resentment had been lifted, and she felt that, regardless of what the future held, she was at peace with herself and with her father. And so, Edward Collins' legacy was not defined by his wealth, but by a man who, in the last moments of his life, found redemption through love, family, and forgiveness. Robert, alongside Linda, continued this legacy not as an heir to a fortune, but as a guardian of a new kind of wealth, unconditional love.